like mean that does this mean that we're all aunts and uncles?
That's right. That's right.
I always want to, right? Another one. I love it.
we were
Congratulations.
calling him Baby FTAC for a while, but we can call him Baby
Wonderful.
That's great.
Behavioral Health System.
So congratulations to Katie, and we wish her well. This I know has been a opportunity for us to be able to share information across the state and with our various stakeholders. And Danny and I, as you can see, we're in the room together. Nancy's sitting someplace over in the eastern part of the county, so she will be joining us in the presentation. But just so folks are aware who I am and who Danny and Nancy are. So we represent the Southeast Regional Mental Health Services Coordination Office, which is a kind of an arm of the 5 Southeast counties Departments of Behavioral Health. We do work around, as you may be familiar, forensics and reentry with the Department of Corrections for the 4 suburban counties. And then we also do special projects on behalf of the 5 counties. And in this particular presentation, this was a project that we floated out to the department, or the Pennsylvania's Association of County Commissioners, the PACA group, the County Administrators group. And through their forensic subcommittee, they asked for the project to move forward. So I'm going to go ahead and screen share what we're presenting today. And we're going to be kind of wrapping it up with a lot of information at the end of the meeting, with making sure that you guys get sent out the actual PDF of the PowerPoint, as well as the actual executive summary and recommendations. So Nancy works in my office as a consultant, has a vast amount of experience in working with forensics and criminal justice. This is the conversation. As well as myself and Danny, and we've kind of been around the block a little bit. So what I wanted to kind of start out by saying here is that really what we know is reentry is a process. It is not a destination. When we've worked with people throughout the last 25, 30 years, we are working with populations that have really, with the Department of Corrections and the counties across the state, we've been doing this for a very, very long time. And certainly there's been a lot of changes. Not only are there staff and administrative changes and policy changes and you know, the approach of who we, and then there's lawsuit changes. But some of those changes have actually helped us to do some of the work that we do today. So what we have been kind of in the history of our region in the Southeast counties and also within the state, we know that we have built kind of a system around supporting individuals who are coming out of the Department of Corrections. And with that in mind, it's similar to that of maybe some of us counties and staff, case management folks who do work around people who have come out of state hospitals. An awful lot of planning goes into supporting someone who is coming from an institution into the community, and how we hope to kind of circle around the supports to make sure that that successful reentry into the community really becomes their kind of landing ground. So our hope for the future is that we would have similar approaches in our Department of Corrections reentry processes, is that when we're doing support, when we're doing reentry planning and supports, we're helping those individuals really kind of be that they're not going to circle back around and go back in. So with that being said, some of the basics, and I'll just run through this in terms of the information that I'm presenting, because most of us probably on the line know some of the basics. as the Department of Corrections, kind of what we call DOC 101, which are, there's a roster. That roster from the Department of Corrections comes to the counties. Thankfully, it comes now on a monthly basis, and we appreciate that OMSAS is a part of that, kind of the filtering of the roster. And what we're really paying attention to is the categories of people who have that mental health diagnoses or that who have mental health needs. And primarily, we're always focusing on those individuals who are categorized as C roster or D roster. Primarily, we focus on the D roster individuals because those individuals have at least at minimum, a diagnosis of an SMI. They might have intellectual disability as well. They certainly are likely to have some type of functional impairment and experience based on their incarceration. But this roster is really kind of the landing pad for where we begin our work. And that for the Southeast counties, and again, any of the forensic liaisons out there, we look at the roster as kind of okay, who's coming? Where do we begin our work? Which has always been helpful because that roster comes to us with at least 2 years of some information to do some pre-planning, usually about 16 to 18 months. But if we're lucky, we might even have 2 years worth of information. The one thing is that we have been discovering that through the various different continuity care procedures with the Department of Corrections, that while there's definition given to individuals who have a max out plan or those final, final date that they're going to remain in the Department of Corrections, there have been individuals who are now starting to show up on that roster as what we would consider parole violators or individuals who are now being paroled prior to their max out. So about 2022, we started, actually 2020, we started in the Southeast counties working very closely with some of our regional parole partners. And we were discovering that as names were starting to show up on the roster, we were having more individuals who were kind of getting ready for parole release. And we were kind of getting hey, surprise, they're going to be out in the next week or two, or maybe a month. And we need to try and help support those individuals, obviously, with their parole plan, as well as their reentry to the community. So we actually pulled some information together and we developed a proposal. And that proposal was to think about developing a work group that would look at the parole reentry process and parole reentry protocols and submit that proposal to the state and to our county partners and say, hey, would you be willing for us to, kind of work on this as a little bit of a work group? The proposal was submitted back in like November of 2022. And I think actually it was written in like September of 2022. And then in November of 2022, it came, the county authorities and the PACA group and County Commissioners Association and OMSAS said, yes, we think that this would be a good idea. We also, of course, had partnership with DOC throughout all of this. So what we were really looking at was this issue around reentry and who might be eligible for parole and who meets the hard to place criteria. I'm going to see if Danny, so Danny's going to present a little bit of information about the detail. But what I thought was really important for us was to try and get a full complement of stakeholders to help to work through this. We know that individuals who are on the mental health roster Some of those individuals may have violated their parole eligibility and now are reincarcerated. And what was, as I mentioned before, many of those individuals were starting to show back up on the roster with short terms to be released. But the problem was we didn't really know who they were beforehand, and we did not know what their situation was. Maybe they were categorized beforehand, or they were already in the community, having been on community supervision and then back into the DOC. So we did a little bit of research, and obviously we know that a lot of people who have a lot of individuals have may be eligible for parole. And then one in the Department of Corrections, the number of persons who are really approved for parole release, about 44% of all those individuals may be eligible or are eligible and or granted for parole. So this was some of the concern of, well, if we have individuals who are on C roster, D roster, and those individuals are getting granted parole, how does that complement the process with our hard to place planning for individuals who would be maxing out? And what we discovered was there was really no established timeline for notification around reentry when a person is paroled. We do have, however, an established timeline for individuals who are maxing out. And for the most part, we try to follow that so that, again, early planning helps and results in a better plan. But what we decided to do was some data, and we did data digging throughout the years. And Danny has probably most of the data that goes back to, I'd even say maybe about 2016, 2015 around the DOC roster. And we were very fortunate enough to gather some of that information at one point in time, not only for the Southeast region, but for the state level. So we were able to gather some of that information. So I'm going to hand this over to Danny a little bit and he can kind of walk through some of the numbers.
Excellent. Thanks, Dorian. And so, yeah, we'll, I don't want to spend too much extra time on this to lose people into the numbers, but we did find that some of this information is certainly quite significant and played a lot into how we decided to go about this process. So when we were looking at this, we wanted to figure out, all right, so about how many people are we talking about? And as Tori mentioned, that kind of starts with the roster. Excuse me. And so the most recent roster that has been received from the DOC through OMSAS sent out to the counties was just earlier this month in July. And as you can see, there were just over 2,200 individuals on that roster. And roughly 14% of them are D roster, and the rest, or the remaining 86, are on the C list. And so one thing that I've noticed over the recent years that was a factor in going into this project was I was seeing that there might be people who are first added to the roster who already have a max date that's expired, or there are people who are popping back up on the roster as I'm noticing for maybe a second or even a third or more times. And maybe their max date has changed and been extended, maybe it hasn't. So we knew that the roster is an excellent tool and a great reference as a point in time. However, it's extremely difficult, if not even impossible, for that to be perfect. And as far as relating 100% what is reality and the actual complete numbers, but it definitely gave us a better place to start and to work from. So we started looking at a collection of some of the numbers over recent years. And on this slide here, we wanted to reflect what the just population or the census or the total amount of the roster was. And as you can see here, going back to 2019, we tried to focus on just one point in time each year. So we have here the July roster, excuse me. And again, these would be the full roster numbers for every county in Pennsylvania. So you'll see here that again, starting in July of 2019, there were 2,152 individuals on the C list and 558 on the D list, ending in the most recent roster we just had earlier this month in July, as I mentioned. And there was a few things that I noted right out of the gate that was interesting, at least for me certainly, which was that in the earlier years, when things was starting out in the DOC was more trying to fine tune some of the mental health processes and ways they were working with these individuals. And we noticed then that there was kind of not a flash in the pan, but in the earlier years, or the first few years, there was a focus or an increase in the number of folks who were either SMI, or there was a really larger number of individuals identified. And playing into that, we realized was a couple of things. Certainly, the DOC was getting better at identifying these individuals, first and foremost. At one point, they also were getting better at assessing diagnoses. And also then they'd implemented the actions such as screening everyone at inception when they first come into the DOC for mental health, among other things, certainly also DNA needs and others. So that played into the identification and kind of some of the increases that we were seeing initially. And also then why we were seeing maybe a little bit as the years went on, kind of a leveling out in that there were some ebbs and flows in the numbers, but we were seeing less and less dramatic changes, as kind of you could see here in the numbers. They are still changing, and who is on the roster can still certainly change month to month, but the numbers themselves are stabilizing and have been stabilizing in recent years. So the other big number we were looking at, as we mentioned, is the number of parole violators on the roster. And years ago, pre-COVID, certainly there was a process in place that the DOC had for helping individuals, specifically those who were hard to place or had mental health issues and SMI diagnoses, try to become more eligible and able to parole through the hard to place process at Waymart. And why am I suddenly blanking on what that was called? Just the hard to place process at Waymart. Oh my gosh. Drawing a blank. It's so not in my
That's all
brain.
right.
Excuse me. Some of you, I'm sure, know what I'm talking about. I apologize. But then, of course, COVID and other circumstances played into the that going away in the full capacity that it was in back in the earlier years. But so that was kind of an idea we had also, looking at the numbers of parole violators and people on the roster to say, hey, how can we get or help get more individuals who have an SMI diagnosis to be receiving more positive opportunities for parole, and then actually getting out more on parole. And so then we were looking at then again exactly who is on the roster and when are they showing up on the roster, how long. We have to factor in, especially looking at parole violators, the very just challenging to know about category of Act 122, which I've been learning about for a number of years now, and still feel like there's a lot that I have left to learn about it, just because it's just a hard thing to understand without being able to be directly involved in it all the time. So we had to figure out what we didn't know we didn't know. It was a large part of our learning curve as well, in collaborating and partnering with our DOC and parole partners to try and get to the crux of some of this issue to see how we could make lasting change. And yes, just to make a kind of drive this point home, as I mentioned, the roster population can and does definitely fluctuate. So while the numbers, total numbers, are kind of leveling out in a sense, in that they are not dramatically changing up or down, who is on the roster month to month can definitely change, and does. Whether that's individuals who are re-paroling as part of Act 122, the roster being based on individuals' max out dates also does not capture, at least what I've found to be true, the majority of people who parole, because those people who parole tend to have max out dates that are farther into the future than that which are captured on the roster in that kind of 18 to 24 month window. So then we had to kind of develop ways to have a little bit more extra communication, either with other institutional staff and parole staff, to make sure we're being able to talk about the right individuals with enough time to plan for their parole to be looked at favorably.
So the one thing that Danny references, and Nancy might want to hop in here, is this idea that what we didn't know, we really didn't know. And I think that many of the counties, unless they've been working either in corrections or with parole for a number of years, or have come from parole to behavioral health, the two systems of parole and the system of kind of reentry for mental health don't seem to match up in the timelines. So of course, one of the things that we did talk about was this proposed idea of let's come together and develop some best practice reentry for persons who are being paroled with serious mental illness, and to really establish some responsibility around who's supposed to do what, and what are the communications and information sharing, and then really to feed back to the entities of the Department of Corrections and OMSAS and the counties to make some recommendations around development of some protocols and policies to support this reentry population. So Nancy, I'm going to hand it over to you just for a second and ask you to talk a little bit about the process for the work group.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. So as Tori said, the previous slide outlined the 3 goals that we use for the work group. We met monthly from November 2022 to June of 2023. And what we wanted to do was put a timeline around this work group so that it didn't become one of those groups that goes on and on and on and doesn't come up with some specific recommendations at the end of a specific time. We had, as you can see there, representation from across the system, the DOC, field service people, OMSAS, county offices, advocates, and people that work directly with people with mental illness in the criminal justice system. We met monthly, and our meeting was very structured. We reviewed the goals each time. We had a list of materials distributed at the meeting, and people did homework, reading. We did a brief summary of the work completed the previous month. We did a presentation of a topic for learning and discussion, and we identified the next steps for the upcoming meeting. We also, I think in December of 2022, did a survey that was then discussed at the January 2023 meeting. We did spend some time learning about the parole process and communications. And as Tori and Danny both indicated, that was an area that was pretty new to a lot of us. It's very, it has a timeline, but again, the timeline does not sync up with other timelines that we all use to get the work done that we want to accomplish. The work group also identified some common themes. As we came to an end, we then put together a list of recommendations and next steps. And those next steps have started with Tori going out to the different authorities to say, you know, we have an idea of doing particularly a pilot project that we would like to try, and could we have your blessing to do that? And we did get permission to move forward in that direction, and now we're starting to figure out the best way to do that. Interestingly, we have discovered as we are learning, figuring that out, that we have found new areas that we didn't know about. So I think part of this effort is going to be an ongoing learning process. Just when you think you understand how either the DOC or the mental health system work, something new comes up that you didn't know about that will have an impact on how we figure out a timeline for planning for this population. I think the information that Tori will give you at the end of this meeting where the summary will be forwarded to you. It's 184 pages long. So I would say don't get put off by that. That seems like overwhelming. The summary itself is only 7 pages. And then there are attachments. There are attachments, for example, we had a written record of every meeting. You could read that or not read that. But I think there are some really helpful things that are attached that include the outlines of these processes, some policies and things like that, that if you are in a situation that we were in, you may or may not know about, and it'll be right there for all of you in one place to start to use. So do you think I covered that, Tori?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you. Thanks, Nancy. And you know, the wonderful opportunities that we've had in working with the partners of the DOC, I should just kind of back up and mention a little bit. The Deputy Secretary for Reentry, Kelly Evans, and her Special Assistant, Matt Schaefer, Missy Repshire, Jess Penshires, many of the folks from the DOC really were very patient to teach us about reentry. And the parole field office, the parole agents, the parole partners that we've been working with over the years also share similar kind of, hey, we are interested in learning about mental health as well. And how does your mental health system work? So I think that one of the things we all kind of came away with was we all have best intentions to work with one another, which is really kind of the first place that we really felt like certainly partnerships can be established as we move forward with this project. And where we may have wanted to land, we might not land in the end, but we certainly are definitely at a place where the partnerships and the agreements are being worked on. So one of the things that I'll just kind of talk a little bit about is basically the brief recommendations. I believe we had 9 recommendations, and when we started this dialogue, it was really to make sure that we had some kind of a formalized written process of this work group. And in turn, we also are making recommendations to have some type of a formal agreement or a memo of understanding between the partners here, and that would be with the Department of Corrections, DHS, the counties, the county mental health programs, as well as the County Commissioners Association, that we're working together and that we all have good intentions. The comment where it says a formal written business agreement, right off the bat, people kind of went, well, that means that we have to get lawyers involved. And I kind of said, yeah, I guess that would be a little bit of a challenge. But I think what we realized was we may already have some of these formalized written agreements or MOUs, and we don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel around partnerships with having attorneys and legal guidance around the actual documents themselves. So the number 1 recommendation was kind of a, let's subtly think about how we roll this out without having to make it into a 5-year project to have every solicitor take a look at these documents. The second recommendation was around really thinking about a standardized statewide referral form that would be used by the DOC when making a referral for all release planning. So, a little bit different here. If you've seen one county, you've seen them all.
Or seen one county.
You've only seen one county, right? So the problem here is that every county has their own process for doing referrals for reentry. I know in Philadelphia, there's a 27-page tip referral form. I know in Allegheny, there's a 3-page referral form. In the Southeast County, it's a 2-page referral form that we actually fill out. So the one thing that we recognize is that counties have their own processes, but the State Department of Corrections asked, and I think this is something that we could probably at some point in time have a little subgroup work on, which is having a standardized statewide referral form that captures the basic information that we need to have a person be kind of initiated into the reentry planning. So that's the second recommendation. The third recommendation was to make sure that we have the necessary complement of staff designated to this project, particularly those individuals. And Jess Penshires, who I can't see who's on the line here, but Jess is kind of the mental health reentry hard to place specialist for the DOC. And then we have folks who are the mental health specialists from the OMSAS, and then each county has their own mental health specialist or forensic worker who is focusing on this population. But what we're asking is for the DOC to possibly designate more positions specifically around parole and parole release. So that is something that is not, we believe, in existence today. It may be in the future, but we're still working on that dialogue. The fourth recommendation was to designate again the staff within the Department of Corrections who does the reentry planning to reconvene that process that Danny was mentioning around the SCI Waymark. So the enhanced reentry process had always been very helpful. It focused not only on hard to place population, those individuals who were kind of coming up on like that immediate, like, the countdown is beginning. We got to get everybody in the room to figure this out. But we believe that process in and of itself would be certainly a part of how you can help someone who has been parole eligible, who is now granted parole, and that person now starts to coordinate the process for reentry from the DOC. Number 5 recommendation was to develop some data and information exchange processes here. And one of the things we recognize is that we can't plan for the future if we really don't know how many and who is coming to tap into the support services that we have. So the concept here is that certainly the roster provides us some basic information, but it doesn't provide us sufficient information. And we have talked about the idea of at least showing some de-identified information that might focus on a 2-year period. Certainly knowing who has been returned to the DOC under parole and having those numbers kind of be available to us. But also when we start to talk about actual reentry planning efforts, to make sure that we have available information about what a person might need in terms of their support and treatment. So that might be some PHI, PII kind of information as well. That also triggered the concern around legal and what can and cannot be shared from the Department of Corrections. So we think that we have a workaround with some of this, and we're hoping to be able to address some of this related to information that we currently do get when we're doing reentry. But the question is again, how that hard to place reentry process could help to work towards that goal. The obvious next piece of the documentation was this DC 551, which from the Department of Corrections side, that is their aftercare recommendation form. We have asked and are working with the psychology department and have been working again, with the idea that if the 551 could be expanded a bit, or maybe there's other documents that might be useful, that would support, again, understanding who the person is who is parole approved, who's going to be released, so that we can support that individual with their mental health needs in the community. The number 7 recommendation is certainly, again, what we all kind of felt as we walked away from the work group, is we certainly would like to develop and expand some of our training opportunities, both within the DOC, so that they understand what mental health is about, kind of mental health reentry planning, as well as best practices around how we support individuals in the community. But then the flip side is so that the community understands more about parole and probation and the processes around information sharing and regulations and what those timelines look like. And then finally, how to make sure that somebody has the necessary benefits and entitlements upon their release, so that they can live successfully as possible in the community, so that we're not scrambling at the last minute to try and figure out where they're going to get their medical assistance and Social Security benefits or income from. The big question was, so how do we test all this stuff out? And is there a place to kind of set the stage a little bit to test it out? And what we are recommending is a pilot project that would be maybe about 16, 18 months. The idea would be that we would identify a few key counties, work with the Department of Corrections and Office of Reentry and the parole supervision groups, and to practice some of the ideas that we have suggested, and to see if we can kind of work through any of the ongoing issues or barriers around this. The next piece of this was then to do some evaluation. Obviously, we then kind of summarized it with, we need to make sure we have all kind of opportunities, both from a financial, housing, treatment service, support service, resource pool, to make sure that we're tapping into whatever opportunities we can to try and develop best practices. So the recommendation, these recommendations and the documents have been shared pretty much statewide now. We've done presentations to the Department of Corrections Administration, to OMSAS Administration, to the PACA, the County Association of the Association of County Commissioners, to the counties themselves. And one of the things that we, as Nancy mentioned, we see that everybody said, hey, we really think this makes some sense. But one of the things that we're realizing is that this is a process, and it requires a lot of partnerships with all the players. We decided to start reaching out to our players then. And in, I guess it was January, December, or December and January, we started to get notes from some of our partners to say, hey, by the way, we're not going to be in this position any longer. So this slide just kind of, again, focuses on what we've done so far. So we were reaching out to say, let's begin dialoguing about the recommendations and how can we think about implementing this. Again, we've spent some time reviewing and discussing some of the existing policies. The Department of Corrections has been sharing with us that they're in the process of revising the policy for reentry. So many of the recommendations may, by the time they're finished, be actually implemented into the policies. The one thing that we also had been doing was, let's see whether or not our DOC partners, and particularly in the Southeast region, we sat and met with the DOC partners and said, let's talk about some of the hard to plan cases that were parole eligible now and see what we need to do about supporting those individuals. And how do we kind of prioritize what their situations are? We also did kind of a look back on reviewing cases that we had no notice of their parole eligibility, and where there were some gaps and where they were released, and maybe where were the areas that we could have stepped in and looked at working with the DOC sooner. So we did a kind of, let's look at going forward, let's look at going back. And then one of the things that we recognized was that through our regional coordinator and working with some of the regional parole planning folks, there's new state parole reform limits, and some of the violations and time and the standards for violation times have changed. So that puts a whole different spin on the process, because the parole folks are still kind of dealing with now new changes and reform limits in their system. The one thing that we also were doing was obviously trying to look at the data tracking and monitoring of the rosters and where these PV statuses are and max out cases. So you see some of that information that we had referenced early on. So where we are now, as Danny mentioned, and Nancy mentioned, we're constantly learning new things. We have, since January 2024, as I mentioned, we noted there's some changes in the Department of Corrections administration. So the Deputy Secretary for Reentry is now the Secretary. The Special Assistance for Reentry has moved on. The Chief Department of Psychology has moved on. Social workers are moving on. So it almost feels like the partners that we had been working with for the last 16, 20 months or so now have moved into different roles. And now we have to reconnect and reestablish relationships with the folks that are in their existing roles. We also know that these policy revisions are in the works, and certainly there are parole policy revisions that are in the works that have just come through literally like within the last 3 months around reentry and reentry guidelines. So we're in the process of looking at some of that information. And then obviously when there's new policies and new people, it really means that this is really a new opportunity to make connection and to get to know who and really to both at a state and individual county level, who's in our backyard, okay? Who do we need to make connections with? And what we've done is in the Western region, I know that our Allegheny partners had an opportunity to share a bit about what they do around parole reentry, and their region parole director joined and talked a little bit about that relationship that they have and the opportunities that they can work on. We know it's happening throughout the state. Again, what we don't know is what we don't know unless we're actually starting to build these relationships, though. So what we have kind of done in the last 6 months or so is to kind of reshift our attention, not solely to try and target the recommendations themselves, but now to establish some connections with the new players, the new relationships, the new administration, and to talk through what does make some better sense around implementing some of these recommendations. So at this point in time, we know we have to do some cooperative partnerships with DOC, OMSAS, the counties, PACA. It requires a lot of comprehensive case planning when we're talking about supporting individuals who might have new stipulations to their reentry. And that we really need to focus on, again, kind of our communication. We'll pick up the old phone and make some phone calls, and then also identify what are some of the resources at all levels of the process. I'm going to just kind of pause here and see if there are folks who have comments or questions. I can share the document of the executive summary at the end. But so let me see if folks have any comments or questions for us. And many of you who were on the work group, feel free to share what your thoughts were, or if there was any takeaways that you had in terms of trying to get this off the mark.
It looks like Lloyd has a question.
I do indeed. Thanks for the wonderful presentation and excellent working out of the of this entire project, to you and to Danny and to Nancy, of course. I'm just wondering if you three as a group had one thing to seek that could change things considerably and significantly over the relatively near term, what might, and yeah, this is a difficult question to answer, but what might that one thing be, if you can share?
One thing that we would, well, I think I love the idea that we used to be face to face and we'd all be in the same room together. That helped to make the relationships happen. So I think that that's one of the things that actually helped for us to partner in a different way. Obviously with the pandemic and Zoom being what it is and meetings statewide, if there was some central attention, and I mean central attention at, again, DOC, OMSAS, counties, where there were opportunities to come together to, other than in a Zoom meeting, but opportunities to really kind of have like a retreat where we focus on some of the areas where we clearly see our common issues. I think that I miss a little bit. I miss it a lot, actually, but I think that we did our better work when we were together.
Mm-hmm.
That's just, it's a little bit of a side. We have a lot of work to do, but I think that there are some things that we did better work when we were together.
I certainly would agree with that, and thank you very much. Good observation. Appreciate it.
Eric, I know that you have had a question.
Sid, first of all, thank you for the presentation. I think it's much needed, and the research in this space is, again, something else that's much needed. I would ask, what kind of qualifications, criteria does somebody have to meet to work in that space to engage folks that are seriously mentally ill or in that reentry space, or both? Because when you, excuse me one second, excuse me, can I get just a tiny bit? I appreciate it. I'm sorry, there's a lot going on here, because there's a couple of different things that happen, because I'll give you my personal history. I was actually on the D roster at one particular time. 7 years ago, I was on the D roster. 5 years ago, I walked out of a state prison. I was on the D roster because of a diagnosis that I got in 1991. And so the evolution of your mental health state is something that might not necessarily be taken into account. You can get assessed when you come into the DOC initially, or you can get an evaluation somewhere along the line during the time that you're incarcerated. And your reentry is determined upon that initial assessment.
Yeah.
Not necessarily where you are at a particular time in your
That's interesting.
period of incarceration. So while I had an initial assessment when I came into the DOC, when I was an angry young man, my evolution in the DOC did not reflect my evaluation or my diagnosis. So there's some things in there, there's some nuanced things in there that I recognize when you're giving this presentation from my perspective, from a stakeholder that is not just somebody who's collecting data empirically. For me, it was more experiential. So that's why it's a concern to me to say we need DOC staff or we need somebody in the DOC. We need to identify personnel in the DOC to monitor or engage folks in this space where I don't know that those people exist. That's a particularly special person, I think, because you need to really understand a lot of the nuanced things that are going on. I know that's a lot, and I'm kind of scattered. There's a lot going on around.
No, I appreciate your comments, Eric. Thank you for sharing
Yeah.
and speaking up. I definitely agree with a lot of what you were just saying. I think I was going to keying off a couple of things in that. I know one thing I would like in a perfect world, if I could just snap my fingers and have it be different, would be is while it's great to have a lot of self-reported information from the individuals who are, of course, themselves incarcerated about their mental health, about their history, about where they've come from, what they're struggling with, that at times that could skew the work, just because at times when individuals are reporting information about themselves, they might not be in their best state of mind when they're providing that information. So there's just can be an inherent flaw in some of the information. So being able to have, as you mentioned, some of those more empathetic and qualified and able-bodied professionals who can have not only be more of them, but also then have that more ability to reach out to counties to be able to do some greater in-reach, which would be a bit of an expansion of the abilities of the DOC now. They could do that some, but certainly not, to reaching out to every county about everyone coming into the DOC to ask about if this person has any history, which many do. And sometimes that gets sent up or forwarded to the DOC, but just not always. So that's definitely one aspect we'd like to be able to kind of increase that communication to the DOC so that they can have a bit more knowledge about an individual that maybe they haven't worked with yet before they start working with them, to kind of maybe clear up some of what you had mentioned about that struggle around just basing everything off of an old evaluation from years and years ago.
I wonder if, I wonder
also have
also,
just, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I wonder if also the work that you're talking about, now certainly we have peers in the certified peer specialists in the mental health system, but are there enough certified peer specialists, forensic certified peer specialists within the DOC that can do some of the work around reentry? And I think this is where the systems are very siloed, even within DOC, is that there's a department that does reentry, then there's a psychology department, and then there's a parole department, and then there's an institutional parole person who's going to work over here with the individual to figure out whether or not the plan is going to work in the community. So they're all kind of like separate little lanes that people kind of, unfortunately, they stay in their lane. And what they need to do is kind of cross lanes a bit. I think that your point, though, is really well taken of people change over time. So getting the most updated information about a person's needs and their desires and their goals is really critical for us.
And also,
Past is
also
important, but to getting the most updated, and that's a challenge that we have with getting information in the community, is getting timely, current information.
no question.
Getting
And
better, but yeah.
I'm not gonna hijack the conversation, but I will just follow up just by saying this though. There's a difference between being angry and having a mental health issue.
Yeah.
And there's a difference, and some of the policies that are in place in the DOC create in you a creative way to get something. as a result.
Mhm.
For example, if I want to be in a single cell, I know that I need a mental health evaluation that'll get me in a single cell. And now I want to make sure that you know that if you put me in a cell with somebody, I'm going to do something to them. In a mental health space, that's going to be documented as me being antisocial.
Right.
And now I can be in a single cell. Now I'm on the D roster. And all I wanted was a single cell. So I'm going to do what I need to do to stay in that single cell. So some of the policies create avenues or creative mechanisms or ways for you to manipulate it, and that can show up in ways that are statistically insignificant.
Definitely.
Thanks, Eric. That was very helpful. Cynthia, I see that you have your hand raised as well.
Thank you, Valerie. And I know Tori's probably smiling. Will I ever not say something in terms of a comment? Nancy probably too. They've heard me a million times, but I wanted to kind of connect a couple of dots with things that Eric just said and Tori, you just said as well. I'm going to also blame Ray McMenamin on this one because we were on a call talking about a role that's in Bucks County last week that they have that's a boundary spanner. And I think, Tori, you just rattled off all of the people involved from the state and locally and all the different institutions that are involved with folks coming out. And, one of the things that I'd like to say locally, I hope in the role working with Danny, who's helping plan and connect the dots here in Montgomery County when somebody is leaving, is also a caution. It's kind of the flip coin of what Eric just said. I definitely want there to be current information, but folks who have mental health crises and folks who are experiencing things out in the community also bounce in and out of different hospital settings and prison health settings, and then come with new diagnoses that might not match anything that they have ever experienced in the past because they're in an acute situation that is highly stressful and presenting in a very particular way based on the environment they are in, but doesn't actually connect to their long-term history. And there really needs to be roles of folks who, to Eric's point, really understand the nuance of what correctional institutions are like, what that's like when someone is there for 1 year, in and out 5 times in 1 year, or inside for 20 years. Those are all very different scenarios. And, if we want to do this well, we need people who have the experience to understand those situations and who also understand mental health and are willing to read 190 pages of medical history to try and connect those dots. And, it's important. It really is. And Eric, I'm down for reading that report with you too. But if we really want to do this well and we want there to be longevity and we want people to be able to be supported appropriately, responsively in their environment, we need folks who are able to do that. I'm preaching to the choir, so now I'll shut up.
Yes, thank you.
No worries. Thank you, Cynthia.
And ditto.
Yeah.
The one thing that I think we expect, a lot of people who have had significant traumas and just themselves of being in an institution where the control and sometimes the self has been now relabeled, re-diagnosed, whatever you want to call it. I think that one of the challenges that we have is particularly when someone is being released with parole status, and that is quite much more abbreviated. I'd like to, just share a quick picture of a parole. I'm going to try and get to it in a second here, of what the parole timeline looks like in, hold on here, what a parole timeline looks like. So I don't know if folks can see this.
Stop the share. The show.
Do I have to stop the share of the show? I think I just shared.
We got it. We see
Okay,
it.
yeah,
You're seeing that, right? So the Pennsylvania parole process, and this is a document that actually is in our executive summary. And you can see, like, when we start the preparation of the parole, the case file, what has to be done, certain things that are within, 8 months, 5 to 6 months, 4 months, 3 months, on average, what's going to happen prior to release. And then, oh, we've got a whole new system to enter into. And that whole new system doesn't quite match up with the timeline of the system of parole. And that's called the mental health reentry process. So one of the things that again, the kind of the silos that we live in, the different lanes that we seem to stay in, appear to me to be part of the challenge that I think as we move forward with this process, it really does mean that we need to have really dedicated, committed partners if we're going to actually formalize something in the future around this. So I am going to also just quickly share, and I don't know if folks have additional questions. I'm going to just share the actual document if I can find it now. Might not be able to find it. I think I have it open somewhere. I don't think I have it open. So
You already said it.
the reference that Nancy made of the existing document of 180 some pages, we appreciate that folks are probably going to go, what? But it's not that bad. So Valerie and folks from FTAC, Lloyd, Lucy, if when it's time to send it, it's a PDF, it's a document, but there are documents within that document that we kind of pulled together that really does describe much about the parole process, and then gives some guidelines around some of the maybe better practices, or some of the practices of the counties around reentry. So feel free to share that, to borrow it, to steal it, to whatever you need to do so that you can to learn that a bit.
I think there was a mention in the chat that we could start a little book club maybe to go over. I thought that was
I like that.
really
I
nice
like
idea. Yeah.
It is, just to be clear, this is Lloyd, it is our intention to distribute those documents with any write-up or notes or questions from the meeting. You may rest assured that the detail that you will learn from those documents will be far greater than any that I can share in these meeting notes. So please look at your mailbox. They'll be coming to you.
Yes, and we're also recording this, and we can send the recording along as well if you want to share it. I'm not sure if folks have other questions. I actually have a question. I'm wondering, this has been such a collaborative effort and really a fantastic presentation. Really appreciate the deep dive. As somebody who's not really from the forensic world, it's very helpful to see the collaboration that's been happening to try to put together some of the gaps and try to think of some solutions. This is a really diverse group of folks who meet on a pretty regular basis. Do you see a role for this group in how to move this information forward? Anything that this group can do in order to assist as you guys are thinking about what the next steps are with this information?
Well, right off the bat, if there's folks who are out there doing something that they think, hey, it kind of works, or hey, this is a challenge that we've seen and we know that our partners over here are seeing the same challenge, let's bring that to the forefront, because there's no perfect answer for moving this process forward. What we have the ideas about is that there could be some ways, for instance, some of the counties that have community correction centers. We know that those counties that have community correction centers get notice sometimes when a person's coming to that CCC. And then their working relationships and the roles may be a little bit more intensive than they were if they were just doing a max out case. Or they might not have known, but yet it was an opportunity for us to actually do some reentry work. And when I say reentry, I kind of mean the global, like, let's figure out where a person's going to live, how they're going to have a productive life in the community, as well as kind of, what I call live, laugh, and love. Like, these are the things, like, I want to be able to have social connections. I want to have a place over my, a roof over my head. I want to have the opportunities to do things so that my recovery in the community is the most optimal. The point though is that there are folks that are out there doing this now, and we would be really interested in hearing what works. Really what works, because maybe these formalized 9 recommendations that are all formalized, that's just a piece of it. Maybe there's something out there that's kind of somebody's already doing something that's been successful, 70% or 60% of the time. But I do think a lot of this has to do with relationships and our connections to our partners.
Such an excellent point. Thank you, Tori. So, I'll encourage people to think about that. If there is something that's working in your particular community or your particular setting, Tori, they can just reach out to you and let you know, hey, we've had success with this. Have you thought about this? That would be the right way to approach you.
Myself or Danny, our contact information is going to be certainly in the slide deck, as well as you'll see the information in the executive summary, and folks kind of know where to find us. So
Lisa also made an important point talking about resources and how identifying resources can be incredibly helpful. I would say that's probably a need for everyone, but she's particularly working with folks on Megan's list. So Lisa, I don't know if you wanted to say anything more about that, but I think that's an important point, that the need for resources is great for folks.
It's very difficult to find any kind of resources. And then if you add on top of that mental health issues, or I'm dealing a lot more with people that are autistic or IDs, and it's crazy.
Yeah, and that actually speaks to a few things. I know, like, back to one of the things we'd mentioned as far as the recommendations along the lines of even having, ideally, in a perfect world, specialized, like, hard to place staff within DOC to even work with each hard to place population. Again, in a perfect world, of course, because right now, Jess Penshire is the hard to place person for anyone who's hard to place. And to say the least, she has a lot to do every day. But certainly, you just mentioned a few other populations of individuals who can at times be individually difficult to place, let alone if they have multiple of those factors going on as well.
Yeah, I get a lot of contacts from the social workers at the SCIs, and then also it's from the veterans that they've reached out to me too.
Yeah.
So it's good to know what resources are out there in order to help them.
Yeah, and kind of along those lines, I would even say that I've found that it's also very key or essential to whenever possible, get eyes on the individual that you're going to be doing reentry with. Many times I've looked at information about a person on paper, as I'm sure many of you in this room have right now, and gone, wow, this person is one way, and then met them and gone, wow, this person is actually completely not like that. So definitely one of the things in which to try to make sure we have both accurate information as well as an accurate understanding and just picture of the whole person.
I second that, Danny. I've certainly been in situations where I've been told this person is all these different things, and I meet them and it's a whole different.
Oh yeah.
So important. Thank you for that. Anybody else have questions, thoughts, things they want to add to the conversation? Going once, going twice.
All right, I got one.
Okay, Eric, I know.
Still on.
I don't want to hijack the conversation, but I wanted to just ask, do you think this is something that's going to require legislation to change? Do you think you can really move the DOC and parole on a policy level? Because I think it's really difficult to move them.
I don't think it would be required.
I'm sorry.
I was just saying, I don't think that would be required. You're certainly not wrong, but maybe that's just me being a little hopeful. But I certainly don't think that it would need to require a legislative move. I mean, I know a lot of times, as Tori kind of even touched on earlier in the presentation, sometimes negative things like lawsuits maybe affect change. I don't think we need to get to that maybe far of a negative point to be able to affect change, but again, I don't know. I would certainly hope that it doesn't need to get to that far of a
Yeah,
point
I don't-
of pushing for legislation, but
I think that, again, the intentions that we really seem to have kind of a common ground on was that we, both DOC and those of us who are kind of in the thick of helping a person come out of an institution, all have really the best intention to try and support the person. I think what happens is the lack of resources and the immediacy of the crisis of,
Mhm.
hey, we got to come up with something now. That really puts a pressure on people, which kind of unfortunately sometimes makes those relationships weakened.
Mhm.
Therefore, part of what we're making the recommendation of is to say, if we have the right people and we can agree to start working together at the right time, and we know what we're going to work on, we can't create more out there in the communities than we already have, because there's still so many people knocking at the door to try and have the resources. But we can make it less traumatizing for a person if we kind of all are working together with this. I mean, we just had a situation, I don't mean to transgress, but we had an individual who came from DOC who was really struggling in the community. We had wrapped around lots of supports around this individual. And it was very clear that that individual felt safer if he was in a more secure setting, with the understanding that it would be very temporary. Because of all the players involved in that, we were able to try and do just that, help him get more stable, more safe, and wrap around the supports so when that person returns back into the community, we have the right type of support for him. His original release, we didn't have the right support for him. He was on a list of like 25 to get into a specific type of a program, and he couldn't jump that list. So the problem is we set folks up for sometimes we don't intend to, an unintended consequence of trauma, because they're coming out, they're not ready, we're not ready. And then what happens is that their mental health or their behaviors kind of really get triggered. And we need to make sure that we have sufficient time. That's the problem with parole. We don't have sufficient time. And I think that
There's also,
it's a situation that I don't think that's a legislative issue, because we don't want people incarcerated. But we do need to make sure that the community supports are really adequate for the person, so that it doesn't become more traumatizing to return to the community.
yeah,
So
no, I appreciate that. I would hope that it doesn't have to be legislative. I also know that when you're in the institution, there's also the perception, the feeling. It's almost like a visceral feeling oftentimes that the DOC is adversarial, and you're a lot less likely to want to partner or be open or vulnerable and just overall honest with folks that are in the DOC, working in the DOC. Like, I'm in parole, I'm in reentry. Folks that are in that space that are actually incarcerated aren't necessarily seeing the DOC as your partner, and somebody you want to partner with all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Because now you're talking about helping me. And just yesterday, or even this morning when I woke up, the same person who's talking about helping me is the same person that would write me in misconduct, if I disobeyed a direct order.
Yeah.
And so there's this strange space that you're all of a sudden now, there's this paradigm shift that you're looking for. So now we're in the process of leaving prison, and you should confide in me and you should trust me and the system, where for a long period of time, this whole system was adversarial, and you were convinced that there's no way that they're going to help you with anything.
Right.
That's really hard to get past.
Mhm.
Eric, Lloyd here, and I really can appreciate your opinion and from where you're coming. But I gotta tell you, when you try and regulate with legislation.
I'm
you
having
run
trouble
in-
hearing you, Lloyd. You're pretty low.
Oh, I'm sorry. This any better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. The thing with legislation is, when you try and regulate with legislation, it is impermeable and it is immovable and it is permanent unless you get more legislation that overrides it. Whereas regulation and resource generation and development, different. You know, you can get other things involved in the system without actually having to go through legislation. I hear you though. Legislation does look like a positive potential for addressing the type of situations we face on a regular basis. However, I would really stop short of that unless all other avenues have been pursued. This is my opinion.
Oh, Lloyd, listen, please don't get me wrong. I would much rather see it, excuse me, come from a policy standpoint, right? Because I know legislation is unbelievably hard to get. So I would really love to see it in policy. I know that the DOC is very reluctant to move in ways that seem to be more empathetic and compassionate and understanding, of course, to folks that have mental health issues or folks that, or in any kind of way that it seems that we are, maybe this is the wrong term, but acquiescing to a particular demographic. Why should we take an approach that appreciates a lot of the layered issues that are going on, the complexities with this particular group? Why should we do that? Everything's set up fine, like, you know. And so that's been my experience, Lloyd, inside and outside. I do, not to put myself in a totally different category, but I do have a different perspective from both inside experiencing also, like I said, and seeing in a way how people work in this space now. It's one thing to listen to legislators. It's another thing to actually see people change something. And I appreciate it all. So yeah, Lloyd, I'd love to see it on a policy level. I definitely would.
I really appreciate this conversation because I think that what this sort of report does is it educates and it brings people together to talk about where the challenges are and have a frank look about what we could be doing to improve the system. And as you're saying, Tori, it's bringing together all of these different folks who may not necessarily be looking at the same information or from it to the problem with the same lens. And Eric, I think that's one of the reasons why things like stories are incredibly important, and people who have been part of the system having a presence in these conversations is crucial. You may not be looking at legislation, but you might be looking at education. You might want to be building relationships with people who do have access to funds and dollars that could provide better resources for programs that will be making sure that those gaps are filled and that there is a streamlined and seamless process for people coming out. So, I think that reports like this are a great foundation to start having those conversations. So for that, I am very grateful to the folks who did the work on this report. And Tori, thanks for the feedback on what we can do to support as well. I'm hoping that this is not the last of us talking about this. It sounds like people are very interested and perhaps will have more to say once they have a chance to take a look at the report, which, as Lloyd said, we will be sending out. One last open for any other questions for Tori, Danny, or Nancy on this wonderful presentation. So as we move into September, our next meeting is going to be on September 24th at 10 a.m. That meeting is actually going to be one where we are talking about what's happening in our own neck of the woods. So if folks can be ready to come and talk about those challenges, but also those successes, things that are working, resources that are happening in your own area. That's going to be what the focus is. I am not sure if Katie will be back by that point. So please watch out. There may be an alternative link again, probably the same link if she is not back at that point. But we will send out information closer to time of the next meeting just to clarify. So any last questions before we break for today?
Valerie, I just wanted to say thank you to FTAC and to the FITF group, but also to the counties and the partners and the kind of the everybody who was involved in helping to pull this together, who spent the time. We definitely have a really strong state coalition.
Mhm.
Let's call it that,
Definitely.
of individuals who are interested in the best that we can possibly do and to support people who have serious mental illness. So I just want to say thank you to all of you guys out there who were part of this project.
And thank you so much for your wonderful presentation today, guys. We will send the information. Enjoy the rest of your summer. Try to stay cool. Hope you guys are doing something fun and taking care of yourselves. And we will see you in September.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.